The frost does not check the calendar before it comes. It doesn't knock. It doesn't send word ahead. It settles into a field in the middle of the night, and the next morning, everything that looked alive the day before is bent over and gray. And nobody asked it to come, and nobody could have stopped it from coming. I think about that a lot. Not the frost exactly, the arriving. The way certain seasons of a life don't send a letter first. The job ends on a Tuesday you thought was ordinary. The relationship ends in a kitchen, mid-sentence. The diagnosis comes back on a Thursday afternoon while you're still thinking about what to make for dinner. Nobody schedules the cold. It just comes, the way it always has, the way it always will, to every field and every person and every year. So let's start there, because most of what gets said about hard seasons is comfort, and comfort and truth are not always the same thing. Here is the truth. Winter is not a punishment. It is not a sign that you did something wrong, or that you're behind, or that everyone else got a calendar with more spring in it than you did. Winter is not personal. It is structural. It is built into the design of every living thing that grows. And if you can accept that, really accept it, not just nod at it on your way to the next distraction, something in you stops fighting the season you're in and starts asking a better question. Not why is this happening to me? What do I do with this while it's happening? That question is the whole subject of what I want to walk through with you. Because I've watched two people stand in the exact same winter, the same layoff, the same quiet, the same long gray stretch with no visible progress, and come out on opposite sides of it 5 years later. Not because one of them was luckier, because one of them used the cold months to do something the other one never thought to do. The difference wasn't talent. It wasn't who got dealt the better hand. It was what each of them planted while nobody was watching. I suspect some of you listening to this aren't in a dramatic winter at all. No layoff, no diagnosis, nothing you could point to on a calendar and call the start of it. Just a long, low, gray stretch that's gone on longer than you expected, working hard by most honest measures, and still watching the needle barely move. Showing up, doing what's asked, and yet somehow standing in roughly the same place you stood a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, with a quiet suspicion that the problem isn't your effort exactly, it's something underneath the effort, some habit or pattern you haven't quite been able to name yet, let alone change. If that's closer to where you actually are, I want you to know this conversation is built every bit as much for you as for anyone standing in a season that's easier to point to from the outside. The quietest winters are often the hardest ones to take seriously, precisely because nobody else can see them, including, some days, you. I grew up around an orchard, not a large one, 11 acres on a hillside, apples mostly, a few rows of pears my mother liked better than anyone else did. My father ran that orchard the way some men run a church, with reverence, with rules he didn't explain because he assumed the land would explain them to you eventually, if you paid attention. One December, I asked him why he didn't do anything to the trees in winter. They just stood there, bare, black against the snow, looking to a boy of 11 like they'd quit. I remember saying something like that to him, that they looked like they'd quit, and he laughed, which he didn't do often, and he said something I didn't understand for another 20 years. He said, the tree isn't quitting, the tree is working. You just can't see the work from where you're standing. What he meant, I came to learn, is that a fruit tree spends its winter doing something underground that has nothing to do with how it looks above ground. The roots keep working. The tree is building the structure it will need to hold next year's fruit. And it does that work in the cold, in the dark, with no audience and no applause and no visible proof that anything is happening at all. If you cut into the trunk in February looking for evidence of growth, you'd find almost none. The growth doesn't show up until the season changes. But the absence of visible growth in February is not the same thing as the absence of growth. I want you to sit with that for a second, because most of us judge our own winters the way an 11-year-old judges a bare tree. We look at the lack of visible progress and we call it failure. We look at the quiet and we call it stuck. We look at a season where nothing seems to be moving and we conclude that nothing is moving, when the truth might be the opposite. The truth might be that the most important work of your whole life is happening exactly now, in exactly this season, in a place no camera can reach. Here's what I've come to believe after watching a lot of winters come and go in a lot of different lives, including my own. Life moves in seasons, not in straight lines. We want it to be a straight line, a little better every single day, an unbroken upward slope from where we started to where we're going. And when it isn't, we panic, or we blame ourselves, or we blame the people around us, or we quietly start to believe that maybe this is just how it's going to be from here on out. But that's not how anything grows. Nothing in the natural world grows in a straight line. Everything that grows in cycles. Spring, when you plant. Summer, when you tend. Fall, when you gather what came of it. And winter, when the visible growing stops and a different kind of work begins. Work you can't see. Work that doesn't photograph well. Work that the people scrolling past your life will never give you credit for because they'll never know it happened. Some people spend their whole winter trying to make it not be winter. They keep the porch light on past its hour. They keep checking for buds that have no business appearing yet. They mistake the cold for an emergency instead of a season. And they spend every ounce of their energy fighting the calendar instead of doing the one kind of work that winter was built for. And I understand it. I've done it myself. There's something almost unbearable about sitting still in the cold when every instinct in you wants to run toward the first sign of spring, force it, manufacture it, fake it if you have to, just to feel like you're moving again. But the few who get somewhere worth getting, and I mean the few because this really is rare, are the ones who stop asking the season to be different and start asking themselves a different question. Not when will this end, but what does this season want from me? What is the work that only gets done in the cold? Because there is work like that. There's a kind of root work, a kind of foundation work, a kind of quiet rebuilding that almost never gets done in summer. Because summer is too loud, too busy, too full of visible things demanding your attention. Winter clears the noise. That's the gift hidden inside the thing that looks like a curse. It clears the noise long enough for you to finally hear what you've been needing to hear for a long time. I had a stretch like that myself years ago, when work I'd built my identity around dried up almost overnight. And I spent the better part of a year with far more quiet hours than I knew what to do with. I'm not going to pretend that year was pleasant. It wasn't. There were weeks I didn't see much point in getting out of bed before 10. But somewhere in the middle of it, I started reading again, really reading, the way I had as a kid before life got busy enough to crowd it out. And I started writing down, badly at first, what I actually believed about how a life gets built. Nobody paid me for that. Nobody applauded it. It didn't look like progress from the outside, and most days it didn't feel like progress from the inside either. But everything I've built since then has roots in that one quiet, unphotogenic, apparently unproductive year. The roots were growing. I just couldn't see it yet, because you never can while it's happening. So here's the first thing I want you to take from this, and I'll say it more than once before we're through, because it's the kind of truth that doesn't stick the first time you hear it. The season you're in is not a verdict on your worth. It is not proof of your failure. It is not even, most of the time, an accurate picture of your future. It is simply a season, one of 4, repeating the way they always have, the way they always will. And your only real job inside of it is not to make it end faster than it's going to end. Your only real job is to do the kind of work that season was built for. Winter isn't asking you to suffer. Winter is asking you to wait well. And waiting well is not the same thing as waiting passively. Waiting well means working underground while the world only sees what's above it. Waiting well means building roots while everyone else is still staring at bare branches, wondering when something is finally going to happen. Something is happening. It's just happening where you can't see it yet. I want to pause on one distinction before we move forward, because if I don't make it clearly, everything I've said so far could get twisted into something I don't actually believe, which is the idea that you should never rest, never slow down, never simply be tired without treating the tiredness as a moral failure. That's not what any of this is asking of you, and a tree would be the first to tell you so, if a tree could talk. A dormant tree in January isn't working at full output. It has dropped its leaves. It has stopped photosynthesizing. By any visible measure, it's doing far less than it did in July. And that's not a flaw in its design, it's the design. Winter dormancy isn't the tree pretending to rest while secretly grinding away at full capacity behind the scenes. It's genuinely reduced activity, a real and necessary slowdown, because no living thing, including you, can sustain summer-level output every single month of the year without eventually breaking down in ways that take far longer to repair than the rest would have taken to begin with. So when I talk about roots still growing in winter, I don't mean you're supposed to be just as busy, just as driven, just as relentlessly active in your hard season as you were in your best one. I mean something quieter and, in its own way, more forgiving. I mean that even reduced activity, even a slower pace, even a season that looks from the outside like very little is happening, can still include some small, steady, ongoing motion towards something. 15 minutes of reading instead of 3 hours. One honest conversation instead of a complete repair of every relationship at once. One weed pulled instead of an entire afternoon spent in the garden. The tree in January isn't growing at its July rate. It's growing at its January rate, which is exactly the rate winter calls for. And that's enough. That was always enough. The difference between rest and quitting isn't about how much gets done. It's about whether anything is still pointed in a direction, however slowly, or whether the whole project has simply been abandoned with no roots growing at all, dormant in the sense of dead, rather than dormant in the sense of conserving energy for what comes next. Rest looks quiet from the outside. Quitting looks quiet from the outside too. They can be almost impossible to tell apart by appearance alone, which is exactly why so many people, watching themselves from the inside during a hard season, mistake legitimate rest for failure and push themselves back into a summer pace they can't sustain, out of guilt rather than genuine readiness, or mistake genuine quitting for rest and let an entire season pass with nothing planted at all, telling themselves the whole time that they're simply resting, the way the tree does, when the tree, quietly, underground, never actually stopped. So be gentle with yourself about the pace. Winter was never going to ask you to sprint. It was only ever going to ask you to keep some small, honest motion going, at whatever reduced rate this particular season actually allows, rather than mistaking exhaustion for permission to stop entirely. That's a much smaller ask than it might have sounded like earlier, and I think it's worth saying plainly before we go any further. Now here's the part nobody tells you about winter, or about any hard season, and it's the part that actually matters most. Two people can stand in the exact same storm, same layoffs hitting the same town, same diagnosis, same flooded basement, and one of them comes apart while the other one comes through. It isn't because the storm was gentler on one of them. The storm doesn't know their names. It doesn't check anyone's resume before it arrives. So if the storm is identical and the outcomes are different, the difference has to be somewhere else. And it is. It's in what each of them does with their hands while the wind is blowing. I spent part of one summer, years ago, in a harbor town up the coast, doing nothing in particular, the kind of drifting a young man does when he hasn't yet decided what his life is for. There was an old man down at the docks named Holt, who'd been working those waters since before I was born, and he let me hang around his boat because I was useless enough to be no threat and curious enough to be occasional company. One afternoon, a squall came through fast, the kind that gives you maybe 10 minutes of warning if you're paying attention, and none at all if you aren't. And I watched two boats caught out past the breakwater handle it in completely different ways. One of them panicked. The owner cut the engine, let the sails go slack and flapping, and spent the whole squall fighting the wheel like the wind was something he could out-argue if he just yelled at it hard enough. He took on water. He nearly lost the mast. By the time he limped back into the harbor, he was soaked, furious, and convinced that the sea had it out for him personally. The other boat, smaller, older, less impressive, sitting at the dock, came through clean. I asked Holt how, and he didn't even look up from the line he was coiling. He said the wind didn't treat that boat any different than it treated the other one. Same gusts, same swells. What was different was that the man on that boat had spent years learning exactly how to trim his sails the second conditions shifted, instead of waiting for the storm to be over before he made any adjustments. He said most people think sailing is about getting good weather. It isn't. There is no controlling the weather. Sailing is about what you do with your hands the moment the weather changes, and almost nobody puts in the hours to get good at that part, because it only matters during the 10 minutes that are the hardest 10 minutes of the whole trip. I've thought about that more than almost anything else anyone ever told me, because it maps onto everything. The wind doesn't ask permission before it shifts, and it doesn't care whether you're ready. It blows the exact same gust across every hull in that harbor. What was different between those two boats wasn't the wind. It was the rigging, how it was built, how well it had been maintained, and how quickly a trained hand moved to adjust it the instant conditions changed. Translate that into a life, and you get something close to the whole truth about why some people are wrecked by circumstances that other people simply sail through. The circumstance is the wind. None of us get to choose it. You don't get a vote on the recession, the diagnosis, the industry that vanishes out from under your career, the person who leaves. That part is exactly as uncontrollable as weather, and pretending otherwise is just a way to set yourself up for more disappointment. But the rigging, the daily decisions, the habits, the way you've trained your own hands to respond when things shift, that part is entirely yours. That part you build, slowly, on ordinary days, long before any storm shows up to test it. Some people spend years waiting for the wind to be kinder. They wait for the market to be friendlier, the boss to be fairer, the timing to be better, before they're willing to start adjusting anything about how they're living. And the wind, being wind, never quite cooperates. It keeps shifting, the way it always has, the way it always will, completely indifferent to whether they've gotten their lives arranged the way they wanted first. But the few, and I want to be honest with you, it really is the few who get somewhere worth getting are the ones who stopped waiting for kinder weather and started building better rigging. They didn't get to choose what blew through their lives. Almost nobody does. What they chose was how quickly they'd respond, how well they'd trained their own hands, how willing they were to adjust the moment conditions changed instead of an hour later, a year later, a decade later, after the damage was already done. It is not the wind. The wind is not the variable that separates the wrecked boats from the ones that sail home clean. It's the rigging. It's always been the rigging. And the maddening, freeing truth buried inside that fact is this: you cannot do one single thing about the wind, but you can spend the rest of your life building better rigging, and nobody can stop you, and no storm can take that work away from you once it's done. I want to say one more thing about Holt's boat before we move past it, because there's a detail in that story that's easy to miss. That boat wasn't new. It wasn't the prettiest one in the harbor. From the dock, in calm weather, you'd never have picked it as the one that would handle a squall the best. The advantage wasn't visible until the wind tested it. That's almost always true of good rigging. You don't get applause for it on the calm days. Nobody walking the dock in June says, "Look at that man, how beautifully he's prepared for a storm that isn't even here yet." The work of building good rigging is invisible right up until the one day it isn't, and that one day is usually the only day that counts. So let me ask you something plainly, the way Holt might have asked it if he'd ever bothered to philosophize out loud, which he mostly didn't. What are you doing on the calm days? Not the dramatic days, not the days the storm is already on you and you're scrambling. The ordinary, unremarkable, nothing is happening days. What are you doing with your hands on those? Because that's where the rigging gets built, or doesn't. Nobody builds good rigging in the middle of a squall. There isn't time. It either got built before, on some quiet afternoon nobody else noticed, or it didn't get built at all, and you find that out at the worst possible moment, which is exactly when you can least afford to be finding it out. Here is the line I'd want you to keep out of everything I've said so far. The wind is not yours to control. The rigging always was. There's a particular kind of disappointment that almost nobody warns you about. And it's the disappointment of doing the right thing and watching absolutely nothing happen. Not failure exactly, just silence. You make the call, send the resume, have the hard conversation, put in the extra hour, and the next morning the world looks precisely as it looked the day before. No applause, no shift, no evidence anywhere you can see that the effort mattered at all. And I think more people quit in that particular silence than quit in any actual catastrophe, because a catastrophe at least gives you something to react to. Silence gives you nothing but the temptation to assume you wasted your time. My mother kept a bed of tulip and daffodil bulbs along the south side of our house, and every October, usually on some gray Saturday when I'd much rather have been doing anything else, she'd have me out there digging 6-inch holes and dropping in bulbs that looked, frankly, like nothing. Dried out brown lumps. You'd plant 50 of them, cover the dirt back over, and the yard would look exactly the same as it had an hour before you started. No mound, no sign, just dirt, the way dirt always looks. Sitting there through November, through the first hard freeze, through every single week of December and January and most of February, giving you nothing back. Nothing. For 4 straight months, the most honest report on those bulbs would have been that you'd buried 50 pieces of nothing in the cold, and the ground had swallowed them whole.
And then sometime in March, usually right when you'd half forgotten you'd planted anything at all, a green tip would push up through dirt that still had frost on it some mornings. And within 2 or 3 weeks, the whole bed would be color, yellow, red, that particular waxy orange that doesn't show up anywhere else in nature quite the same way. And the most ordinary part of our yard for 11 months a year would turn, for about 3 weeks, into the best-looking thing on the street. Here's what I want you to notice about that, because it's the whole engine behind everything we call progress. The planting and the blooming were not close together. They were 4 months apart, with nothing visible in between except dirt that, if you dug it up in December out of impatience or doubt, would have shown you a bulb that looked exactly the same as the day you buried it. Maybe even looked like it was rotting, doing nothing, going nowhere. The proof of growth was invisible for almost the entire length of the process. It only became visible at the very end, all at once, in a burst that looked sudden to anyone who hadn't been watching in October. This is, I think, the single hardest thing for a disciplined person to accept, and the single easiest thing for an undisciplined person to use as an excuse. The gap between planting and harvest is real, and it is long. And during nearly the entire length of it, the evidence will tell you that nothing is working. Not might tell you, will tell you. That's not a malfunction in the system. That's the system. Causes and effects are almost never sitting next to each other in time. The effect shows up late, and when it finally shows up, it tends to show up bigger than the cause that started it. 50 brown lumps become a yard nobody can walk past without stopping, but late and big both, which means anyone judging the work by what they can see on any single ordinary day in between is going to misjudge it nearly every time. Some people plant once, check the dirt obsessively for 2 weeks, see nothing, and conclude the whole project was a mistake. They dig the bulbs back up looking for proof, which of course kills them, which then becomes proof to that person that planting never works for people like them. I've watched this exact pattern play out in careers, in marriages, in health, in every domain you can name. 6 weeks of eating differently with no visible change on the scale, and the conclusion isn't, this takes longer than 6 weeks. The conclusion is, this doesn't work. And back come the old habits, with a story attached about how diets just don't work for this particular person. 3 months of putting in real effort at a job that still hasn't promoted them, and the conclusion isn't, good work compounds slowly. The conclusion is, nobody here notices effort, and the effort quietly stops, right around the point where, unbeknownst to them, it might have been closest to finally showing up. But the few, and they really are few, because this requires tolerating a kind of silence most people can't stand. The few who build something that lasts are the ones who learn to keep planting through the part where nothing visible is happening. Not because they enjoy the silence. Nobody enjoys it. But because they've come to understand, the way my mother understood it, standing over that bulb bed every October without a flicker of doubt on her face, that the absence of visible results in week 6 is not evidence against the process. It's simply where the process is supposed to be in week 6. The bulb isn't failing in December. The bulb is exactly on schedule. I want to say that 3 different ways, because it's the kind of truth the mind resists, no matter how many times it hears it once. The work you can't see yet is not wasted work. The silence between the planting and the blooming is not proof that nothing is growing. And the fact that you can't find evidence of progress on any particular Tuesday afternoon means almost nothing about whether progress is actually being made. There's a second part to this that matters just as much as the first, and it's the part about scale. Whatever you plant doesn't come back to you the same size you planted it. 50 small, dry, unremarkable bulbs came back as 3 weeks of color so good that neighbors who'd never said 2 words to my mother in 11 months started stopping at the end of the driveway just to look. That's not a coincidence specific to flowers. That's how this works everywhere. The effort you put in today is rarely the size of the result that eventually comes back. It tends to be smaller, sometimes laughably smaller, than what eventually grows out of it, which is exactly why it's so easy to underestimate small, boring, repeated effort, and so easy to overestimate the importance of any single dramatic moment. Nobody plants a yard's worth of color in one afternoon. They plant 50 unremarkable lumps of nothing in the cold when there's no reward in sight, and they let 4 months of invisible work turn it into something worth stopping the car for. So here's what I'd ask you to take from this, plainly, before we move to the next thing. Stop checking the dirt. I mean that seriously. If you've started something, a habit, a skill, a repair to something that broke, a slow rebuilding of trust with someone you hurt, and it's been weeks, and there's no visible bloom yet, that is not your answer. That's just the middle of the process, which has always looked, to every person who's ever stood in it, exactly like nothing is happening. The bulb doesn't know it's almost March. It just keeps doing the only job it has, in the dark, in the cold, with no proof offered to anyone, including itself. Plant in the cold. That's the whole instruction. Plant in the cold, when there's no reward in sight, when the silence makes you doubt the entire project, when everyone around you who isn't planting anything looks, for now, exactly as well off as you do. Plant anyway. March always comes later than you'd like and earlier than you expect, and it has never once, in the whole history of anyone keeping track, arrived for a bed that nobody bothered to plant. There's another kind of planting that has nothing to do with soil, and it happens almost always during exactly the seasons when a person feels they have the least reason to do it. I'm talking about what you put into your own mind while everything else is standing still. The year I mentioned earlier, the one with more quiet hours than I knew what to do with, I ended up spending a lot of afternoons at the public library 2 towns over, mostly because it was free and warm, and nobody there asked what I did for a living, which at the time was nothing, and I didn't enjoy being asked. There was a librarian on the 2nd floor, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, who I think clocked pretty quickly that I was in some kind of trouble, the quiet, unspoken, no job and too much time kind, and she never said a word about it directly. She just started leaving books on the end of the table I always sat at. Never handed them to me, never made a thing of it, just left them there, like she'd happened to be reshelving and set one down, and some weeks later I'd notice another one in its place. I read the first one mostly out of boredom, something about how small businesses actually survive their first 5 years, which wasn't a topic I had any reason to care about, except that I had nothing else to do and the chair was comfortable. And then I read the next one, and the one after that. By spring, I'd gone through maybe 30 books I never would have picked up on my own, on subjects ranging from negotiation to how factories were organized in the early part of the last century, none of which had any obvious connection to whatever I imagined my future was going to look like. Here's what I didn't understand at the time, and what took me years to fully see. None of those afternoons felt like progress while they were happening. I had no job, no income, no plan really, beyond showing up the next day because the chair was warm and the woman kept leaving books. By any measure a stranger might have used to judge my life that winter, I was going nowhere. But I was reading 2, sometimes 3 hours a day, almost every day, for months. And there is no version of that math that doesn't eventually add up to something. 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, for even a single year, is more deliberate study than most people manage to do in 5 years of an ordinary adult life, crowded with everything else that adult life is crowded with. I wasn't going nowhere. I was simply going somewhere that didn't show up on a resume yet. This is the thing about formal schooling that almost nobody says plainly enough. It teaches you what you need to start. It rarely teaches you what you need to keep going, or to go further than where you started. Because the world keeps changing after you leave the building, and nobody hands you an updated syllabus. What you do with your own evenings after that, what you choose to read, what you choose to study on your own time, with no one checking, no grade attached, No one but you ever finding out whether you did it or skipped it. That's a different kind of education. And in my experience, it's the one that actually determines how far a person eventually gets. Not because the credential doesn't matter. It can open a door, but it's the second kind of learning, the unsupervised kind, the kind nobody's forcing you to do, that decides what you do once you're standing on the other side of that door. Some people finish their formal schooling and quietly close the book on learning altogether, as if the diploma were a finish line instead of a starting gun. They tell themselves they're too busy now, too tired in the evenings, that reading is for students and they're not a student anymore. And life, being patient and unhurried the way it always is, doesn't punish that decision right away. It punishes it slowly, over about a decade, in ways that are almost impossible to trace back to their original cause. The world keeps moving, the tools keep changing, the conversation in their field keeps advancing without them, 1 inch at a time, until one day they look up, and the gap between where they are and where the field has gone feels sudden, even though it was never sudden. It was built one unread evening at a time, for years, the same way a tide goes out, too slow to notice in any given hour, undeniable by the time you look down at your feet and the water's 100 yards further out than you remember it being. But the few who keep reading after nobody's making them anymore, and again, by every measure I've ever seen, it really is the few, end up somewhere remarkable, simply because consistency compounds in ways that feel almost unfair once you see it laid out. A single book a month doesn't sound like much. It sounds, frankly, like nothing, the way 50 bulbs in October look like nothing. But a book a month is 12 books a year. In 5 years, that's 60 books on a subject most of the people around you have read 0 books on since they left school. In 10 years, it's a library of over 100, sitting quietly inside your own head, available to you in every room you ever walk into, every meeting you ever sit through, every decision you're ever asked to make. Nobody can see that library from the outside. It doesn't show up on a business card, but it shows up unmistakably in the quality of the questions a person asks, the options they can see that other people in the same room can't, the calm they carry in the situations that rattle everyone else, because they've quietly been here before, on a page, in some quiet hour nobody else knew about. I think about Mrs. Patterson sometimes, leaving those books at the end of my table without a word, and I don't know that she ever understood what she actually did. She didn't fix my circumstances. I still left the library every afternoon with the exact same problems I'd walked in with. But she handed me, one quiet stack at a time, the only thing that was ever going to actually solve them, which was a slowly growing capacity I didn't have the day I walked in. Circumstances change on their own timeline, and mostly without asking permission. Capacity only grows the way anything else grows, a little at a time, mostly invisible, almost entirely a function of what a person chooses to do with the quiet hours nobody else is watching. So let me ask you something plainly. What did you read this month? Not what did you scroll, not what did you half listen to in the background while doing something else. What did you sit down and actually read, on purpose, about something that might matter to where you're trying to go? If the honest answer is nothing, I gently suggest that's worth looking at, not with shame, just with clear eyes. Because that one habit, more than almost any other single thing I've watched people change, tends to be the hinge an entire decade swings on. Not because reading is magic, because reading, done consistently, over years, in the quiet hours that look like nothing is happening, is one of the few kinds of planting that almost nobody else around you is doing, which means it's one of the few kinds of advantage that's still sitting there, completely unclaimed, waiting for anyone willing to do the unglamorous work of showing up for it. The library doesn't care whether you've had a hard year. It's open the same hours either way. And it's one of the very few rooms left where the door is open to absolutely everyone, and almost nobody bothers to walk through it more than twice. Now let me ask you something a little harder to look at directly, because it has less to do with what you're doing and more to do with who you're doing it around. Who sits at your table? Not literally, although that counts too, who you eat dinner with, who calls you on a Tuesday for no reason, who you spend your weekends near. I mean it more broadly than that. Whose voice is in your head when you're making a decision? Whose opinion you brace for before you even share the news? Whose standard, quietly, without you ever signing up for it, you've started measuring your own life against. I had two friends growing up who started out by every visible measure almost identical. Same neighborhood, same average grades, same general sense that they wanted more out of life than what their parents had managed to get. One of them, sometime in his early 20s, started spending most evenings at a diner 2 blocks from where he worked, with a group of men a little older than him who'd been coming to that same booth for years. Good company in a lot of ways, funny, loyal to each other. But the conversation at that booth, night after night for years, ran almost entirely in one direction. The boss who didn't appreciate anybody, the system that was rigged, the breaks that other people got and they never did, the plan they were all going to get around to eventually, someday, once a few things lined up first. Nobody at that booth was unkind. They just weren't, by habit, expecting much. And over years, that habit becomes a kind of weather a person stops noticing they're standing in.
The other friend, around the same age, ended up almost by accident through a coworker who invited him along, sitting in on a small group that met every other week above a hardware store. A handful of people trying to start small businesses, comparing notes, arguing about pricing and suppliers and which mistakes had already cost them money so the others wouldn't have to make them too. He told me once that he almost didn't go back after the first meeting, because everybody else in the room seemed to be further along than he was, and it made him feel small. But he went back anyway. And then he kept going back every other week for years.
I watched both of those friendships from the outside for the better part of 2 decades, and here's the plain truth of what I saw. The man at the diner is, today, a genuinely decent person. Exactly as funny as he always was, and almost exactly where he was 20 years ago. Not because he lacked the ability to do more, but because every single night for 20 years, he sat in a room where wanting more out of life quietly wasn't the custom. Nobody in that booth talked him out of his ambitions directly. They didn't have to. They just never talked him into anything either, and over enough nights, the absence of anyone expecting more from him became its own kind of ceiling, low enough that he never noticed his head was nearly touching it. The man above the hardware store built 3 different businesses over those same 20 years, lost money on one of them, learned from it, and built something that actually works with the next 2. Not because the room above the hardware store was full of geniuses. It mostly wasn't. It was full of people trying things, several of them failing, openly, in front of each other, which did something the diner never did. It made trying and occasionally failing feel completely normal, which made it far less frightening to keep doing. Here's what I want you to understand about this, because it's easy to hear it as an insult to the people you already love, and that's not what I mean at all. This isn't about abandoning anyone. It's about noticing, honestly, what a room is teaching you to expect, simply by being a regular in it. Attitudes spread the way a draft moves through a house, quietly, with no announcement, finding the gaps nobody bothered to seal. You can resolve with real sincerity to be more disciplined, more hopeful, more willing to take a risk, and then spend 4 nights a week in a room where the unspoken custom runs in exactly the opposite direction. And I promise you, the room wins. It almost always wins, not because you're weak, but because nobody is immune to the temperature of the space they spend the most time standing in. Some people choose their rooms by accident. Whoever happened to be nearby in school, whoever they fell into a routine with, whoever's been at the same job long enough to become the default lunch table. And then they wonder, years later, why their own ambitions feel so hard to hold on to, never once tracing it back to the simple fact that they've spent 4,000 evenings absorbing the temperature of a room they never actually chose on purpose. But the few who end up building something different almost always made a quieter decision somewhere along the way, usually one nobody else noticed them make. They didn't necessarily leave anyone behind dramatically. They just started being a little more deliberate about which rooms they walked into on purpose, and a little less available for the ones that had only ever happened to them by default. They went to the meeting above the hardware store, even on the night they felt out of their depth. They found one person, sometimes just one, who expected more from a Tuesday than complaining about it, and they made sure to be near that person more often than not. I'll say this 3 different ways because I think it's one of the most underestimated truths in any life. You will start to sound like the room you sit in most. You will start to expect what the room around you expects. whether that's very little or quite a lot. And 10 years from now, with almost mathematical certainty, you will be closer to the standard of the table you ate at most often than to the standard you privately, quietly hoped for yourself, but never put yourself in a room built to support. This doesn't mean go find people who are impressive on paper and force your way into proximity with them. That's not it at all, and it usually backfires anyway. It means pay attention to what's normal in the rooms you're already in. Is trying normal there? Is reading normal there? Is talking about what didn't work yet, openly, without it turning into either an excuse session or a shame spiral? Is that normal there? If it isn't, you don't necessarily need to burn the room down. You might just need to find one more room, even a small one, even one that meets every other week above a hardware store with people who don't have it all figured out either, where a different custom is quietly in effect. One room like that, visited consistently, can do more for the shape of a decade than almost anything else I've ever watched a person do on their own. Choose your table, not out of cruelty toward the people already sitting at it, but out of honesty about what that table has been teaching you to expect every single night, whether you ever notice the lesson or not. There's one more piece to this, and it might be the part that explains why so much of what we've already talked about is so hard to act on, even once you understand it. It has to do with what happens to anything you leave alone. A neighbor of mine, a few houses down, had the nicest yard on the block for years. Not fussy, not show-off, just clearly cared for. The kind of yard where you could tell somebody walked it every weekend with a pair of clippers and an eye for what needed attention. Then he had a bad fall, broke a hip, spent most of a summer first in a hospital bed and then in a recliner. And the yard sat untouched for about 4 months. I want you to understand what happened to that yard because it surprised me at the time, and it shouldn't have. It didn't sit still. People imagine that an untended yard simply stays the same, just a little overgrown, as if neglect were a kind of pause button. It isn't. By August, that yard was unrecognizable. Not bare, not paused, but completely overtaken. Vines through the fence, a thicket where the flower bed used to be, grass gone to seed and bent over in clumps. Nothing about that yard had been resting for 4 months. It had been working the entire time, just not at anything he would have chosen. The ground doesn't know the difference between a flower and a weed. It only knows growth, and it will grow whatever shows up first and pushes hardest, with total indifference to what you actually wanted. This is, I think, the single most important thing to understand about discipline, and it's almost never said this way. Discipline isn't really about making something grow. Growth happens on its own, constantly, with no effort required from anyone. What discipline is actually for is determining what grows. Left alone, a yard doesn't go quiet, it goes to weeds. Left alone, a body doesn't stay the same, it goes soft. Left alone, a skill doesn't hold steady at the level you left it, it goes rusty. Left alone, a marriage doesn't simply coast along comfortably. It goes cold, one unacknowledged Tuesday at a time, until 2 people are sharing a kitchen and a calendar and almost nothing else. Nothing in a life actually holds still. The illusion of standing still is just weeds growing slowly enough that you don't notice them yet. So when people say they're not trying to improve anything right now, they're just maintaining, holding steady, taking a breather. I gently push back on that because there's no such category available to any of us. You are either cultivating something on purpose or something else is growing in that same space without your permission. And it is very rarely the thing you would have chosen if anyone had thought to ask you. The choice was never between growth and no growth. The choice was always between this growth and that growth, between what you deliberately planted and what simply moved in because the space was left open. This matters enormously once you start thinking about how value actually gets created. In your skills, your relationships, your standing in whatever field you're in, the price the world is willing to pay for what you bring to it. There's an old confusion a lot of people carry, mostly without examining it, that putting in time is the same thing as creating value, that showing up reliably, hour after hour, year after year, is itself the thing the marketplace rewards. And showing up matters. I don't want to undersell it. But the marketplace, as cold and indifferent as the frost we started with, doesn't actually pay for hours. It pays for value, for the specific, demonstrable difference a person makes that wouldn't have happened without them. 2 people can put in the exact same number of hours over 20 years, and one of them becomes genuinely difficult to replace, while the other becomes, without any cruelty intended by anyone, fairly easy to swap out for someone else willing to do the same hours. The difference was never the hours. The difference was what each of them cultivated inside those hours, on purpose, while the other ones simply let the time pass and assumed the passing itself would eventually be worth something. I think about my neighbor's yard, and I think about a different kind of garden. The actual capabilities a person builds over a working life. Some people tend that garden every weekend, in small, unglamorous ways nobody's applauding. They take the extra course nobody required. They ask the question in the meeting that makes them look slightly uninformed for 30 seconds, in exchange for being genuinely informed for the next 30 years. They fix the thing that's quietly broken instead of routing around it the way everyone else has learned to. None of that looks dramatic in any given week, but weekend after weekend, year after year, it's the difference between a yard anyone would want to walk past and a yard the vines have taken over so slowly that even the person living in the house stopped noticing exactly when it happened.
Some people wait for a crisis to force the issue. Wait until the layoff, the divorce, the diagnosis, before they ever pick up the clippers. And I understand why. Crisis is a loud teacher, and loud teachers get heard. But the few who build something durable almost never waited for a crisis to teach them. They went out to the yard on the ordinary Saturdays, the ones with no urgency attached, the ones that would have been easy to skip, and they pulled the small weeds before anyone else could even see they'd started growing. Not because they were naturally more disciplined than everyone else, in some way that excuses the rest of us from trying. Because they understood early that there's no third option between cultivating and being overtaken. There's only a choice about which one you're actively choosing every single week, whether you've named that choice out loud to yourself or not. I want to say this 3 times, plainly, because it's the truth most likely to slip past you the moment this is over and ordinary life resumes. Nothing in your life is standing still right now. Not your skills, not your relationships, not your health, not your standing in whatever room you spend most of your hours in. Something is growing in every one of those spaces this week, whether you've touched it on purpose or not. And the only real question, the only one that's ever actually been yours to answer, is whether you're the one who decided what that something would be. The ground doesn't care whether you meant to plant weeds. It only knows that the space was open and something had to grow there, and you weren't the one who showed up to decide what. Before I close this out, there's one more trap worth naming because it's quieter than the others, and in some ways, more dangerous. And it has a way of undoing all the planting we've just spent so much time talking about. It's the habit of standing in your own winter while staring directly at someone else's spring. You know the feeling. You're 3 months into a hard stretch, doing the unglamorous work nobody's applauding, and you look up at a neighbor, an old classmate, somebody you barely know who happens to post about it. And there they are, in full bloom, color everywhere, looking for all the world like spring simply chose them and skipped you. And something in you very quietly starts keeping score. Why does their yard look like that while mine is still just cold dirt? What did they have that I don't?
Here's what almost never gets said clearly enough about that moment. You're not actually looking at someone else's whole year. You're looking at 3 weeks out of their 12 months. The 3 weeks specifically designed to be looked at, and you're comparing it against the one season of your own 12 months that happens to be the least photogenic of the 4. That's not a fair comparison. It was never going to be a fair comparison. It's a little like walking past someone's house in late March, seeing the tulips, and concluding they never once had a cold, muddy October where they knelt in the dirt with nothing to show for it either. They did. You just weren't standing there to see it, because nobody invites an audience to October. People only ever invite an audience to March. I had a stretch a few years back where this particular trap had its hooks in me pretty deep. Somebody I'd known since college had what looked, from a comfortable distance, like an effortless run of good fortune. The business doing well, the family photographed looking happy, in a way mine, at that exact moment, mostly wasn't. I spent more evenings that I'm proud of running a quiet, miserable comparison in my head, one that never once worked in my own favor, because I was always comparing my actual, unfinished present against his curated highlight reel, which is a contest nobody's present ever wins. It took an offhand comment from someone who actually knew him well that he'd nearly lost the whole business 2 years earlier, quietly, with almost nobody outside his immediate family aware of how close it had come, for me to realize I'd been comparing my October to his March the entire time, and getting exactly the demoralized feeling that comparison was always going to produce.
Some people let that comparison run unchecked for years, and it does real damage, slow damage, the kind that doesn't announce itself the way a single bad day would. It convinces them that everyone else got handed an easier set of seasons, that the difficulty they're facing is somehow unique to them, evidence of some personal deficiency rather than simply the ordinary cold stretch that comes to absolutely everyone who's building anything worth having. And once a person believes their winter is uniquely unfair, uniquely theirs, uniquely undeserved, compared to everyone else's apparently easy ride, the temptation to stop planting gets a lot stronger. Because what's the point of doing the work if the whole system seems rigged against you specifically? But the few who keep their footing through this particular trap have usually made one quiet adjustment that the rest of us would do well to copy. They've stopped measuring their own unfinished season against anyone else's finished one, and started measuring it against the only honest comparison available to them, which is themselves, a season or two back, before they started planting at all. Are the roots a little deeper than they were last year? Is the rigging a little better trimmed than it was the last time a storm came through? Is the shelf of quiet hours a little fuller than it was 12 months ago? That comparison, the only one that was ever actually fair, the only one built on information you actually have in full instead of 3 curated weeks of someone else's year, tends to produce something entirely different than envy. It tends to produce the next quiet, ordinary, undramatic Tuesday of planting, which was always the only thing this was ever asking of you in the first place. So if you've caught yourself doing it, standing in your own cold dirt, staring hard at somebody else's bloom, quietly keeping a score that was never fair to begin with, let that go as gently as you can manage. Not because their spring isn't real, it is, but because their spring tells you almost nothing useful about your own winter, except, if you let it, a reminder that winters end, which was always going to be true for you, too, on its own schedule, regardless of what anybody else's yard happens to look like this particular March. There's a related fear worth naming, too, while we're on the subject of comparison, because it shows up constantly in people roughly your age, and it deserves a straight answer instead of the usual vague encouragement. It's the fear that you've simply missed your window, that the planting season for your particular life has already closed, that other people started their orchards at 20 and you're standing here at 38 or 45 or 51 with nothing in the ground yet, and the whole enterprise is therefore pointless because you're too far behind a calendar everyone else apparently got a copy of and you didn't. I want to take that fear seriously instead of brushing past it, because it's not a foolish fear. Time is real. Some doors do close. I'm not going to stand here and tell you age is just a number, because that's not true and you already know it isn't. But here's what I've actually watched happen repeatedly in real lives, and it complicates the story most people tell themselves about being too late. An orchard planted at 40 doesn't bear the same fruit on the same schedule as one planted at 20. That's true, but it still bears fruit. The tree doesn't check your birth certificate before deciding whether it's allowed to grow roots. It only checks whether you're willing to dig the hole and put something in the ground today, this October, the one you're actually standing in, instead of the one you wish you'd stood in 15 years earlier. I knew a man, a regular at that room above the hardware store as it happens, who didn't start his first real business until he was 53, after 30 years in a factory job that ended when the plant closed and didn't reopen. By every measure the calendar watchers love to invoke, he was finished. Too old to start over, too far behind people half his age who'd been building businesses since their 20s. He didn't agree with that math, mostly because he didn't have the luxury of agreeing with it. He had a mortgage and 2 kids still in school, and not much choice but to plant something, regardless of what the calendar supposedly said about his odds.
11 years later, he sold that business for enough to retire comfortably, at an age when plenty of his old factory co-workers were still trying to figure out what retirement was even going to look like for them. He didn't beat the calendar. He just stopped consulting it for permission and planted in October anyway, the way the rest of us have been talking about this whole time. I tell you this not to promise you the same outcome, because I can't. And anyone who promises you a specific outcome from a stranger's story is telling you more than they actually know. I tell you this because the fear of being too late almost always rests on a hidden assumption that doesn't hold up once you look at it directly. The assumption that the only orchard worth planting is one that's had 30 years to mature by the time you reach some imagined finish line everyone else seems to be racing toward. But you're not actually competing against everyone else's orchard. You're only ever comparing your possible future against your own continued standing still. And between those two, planting late is still better than never planting. In every single case I've ever personally watched closely enough to know how it turned out. 5 years from now is coming either way, exactly like we talked about earlier. The only real question, the one that was always yours and only yours to answer, is whether you'll have 5-year-old roots in the ground by the time you get there, or whether you'll still be standing at the edge of the field, waiting for a more convenient October that was never actually going to arrive on its own. Let's go back to the orchard for a minute, because I never told you how that part of the story actually ends, and I think you've earned the rest of it by now. My father kept that orchard for almost 40 years, and somewhere in the middle of that stretch, a freeze came through in late April that nobody in the county had seen the likes of in living memory. Well past the date anyone expects frost, right after the blossoms had already opened, which is the single most dangerous moment for an apple tree to get hit. A freeze in January barely registers. The tree is dormant. It's built for that. A freeze in late April, after the blossoms are out and the tree has already committed itself to the season, can wipe out an entire year's harvest in one night. And that's exactly what it did to most of the orchards in our part of the county that spring. I remember my father walking the rows the next morning, looking at blossoms gone black and curled, and I remember bracing myself for him to say something about how the whole year was lost. He didn't say that. What he said, after a long, quiet walk up and down maybe 6 rows, was that the trees themselves would be fine. We'd lose most of that year's fruit, and we did. It was a thin harvest that fall, the thinnest I remember, but the trees had spent decades building root systems deep enough and trunks strong enough that one bad freeze, even a freeze that took the whole visible crop, wasn't going to take the orchard. The roots that had been built in winter after winter, year after year, long before that April ever arrived, were exactly what let the trees absorb a hit that destroyed the work of the neighboring orchard down the road, one that had been planted only a handful of years earlier and didn't yet have root systems deep enough to survive a year like that without real and lasting damage. I think about that whenever I'm tempted to measure a person's life by a single bad season instead of by what's actually been built underneath it. A freeze can take a year's harvest. It happens to nearly everyone eventually, in one form or another. A layoff, a failed venture, a relationship that didn't survive, a health scare that costs you a year you'd planned to spend differently. What a freeze can't take, not in one night, not ever, is root structure that's already been built. The orchards that survived that April weren't the ones that got lucky and somehow avoided the cold. The cold hit every orchard in the county the exact same night. The orchards that survived were the ones that had already done years of unglamorous, invisible, underground work before the freeze ever arrived. Which is the entire idea we started with. Except now you get to see how it actually plays out on the other side of the bad year. Which is the part of the story nobody tells you while you're still standing in the bad year itself. And the harbor, let me close that one out too. Because Holt's boat has one more thing to teach us. I went back to that town almost 15 years later, mostly out of nostalgia, half expecting the harbor to look completely different. Holt had passed by then, but the boat was still there, still being kept by his son, who told me something his father had apparently said for years to anyone who'd listen, though he'd never once said it to me directly while I knew him.
He used to say that the worst storms he ever sailed through taught him less than the 100 ordinary afternoons he spent maintaining lines and checking rigging when there was no storm anywhere on the horizon at all. The storms tested what he'd built. They never built anything themselves. All the actual building happened on the calm, unremarkable days that nobody, including Holt himself most of the time, thought were worth writing home about. I want you to notice something about both of these stories, because it's the same shape, told twice in two different settings. And once you see the shape, you'll start noticing it everywhere else too. Neither story is really about avoiding hardship. My father didn't figure out how to stop frost from ever coming. Holt didn't figure out how to make the sea calm on command. Nobody gets that option. And it would be dishonest of me to stand here and suggest otherwise to you. The frost still comes. The storm still hits. What both stories are actually about is what gets built in the meantime. In the long stretches of ordinary time before the frost or the storm ever shows up. And whether that building was done with any intention or simply left to chance, the way my neighbor's yard was left to chance for 4 months, and came back nothing like he'd left it. This is where I want to bring everything we've talked about back together, because each piece we've gone through is really the same truth, looked at from a different angle. The seasons taught us that the quiet, invisible stretch isn't a failure. It's where the next harvest gets built, whether you can see it happening or not. The wind and the rigging taught us that we don't get to choose the conditions, only how well we've prepared to respond to them. The bulbs taught us that the gap between planting and blooming is real and long, and that the absence of visible progress on any given day is not evidence the work isn't happening. The library taught us that the quiet hours, the ones nobody is grading and nobody is watching, are exactly where a different kind of capacity gets built, slowly, for years, until it shows up all at once in ways that look sudden to everyone who wasn't paying attention the whole time. The table taught us that the room you sit in most will eventually start sounding like you, or you'll start sounding like it. And that choosing your rooms on purpose is one of the few decisions available to almost anyone, regardless of where they started. And the garden taught us that there's no neutral option. Something is always growing in the space you've been given. And the only real choice is whether you're the one who decided what. Every one of those is, underneath the metaphor, the exact same instruction, said 6 different ways, because some of us need to hear a truth more than once before it actually changes anything we do on a Tuesday afternoon. Build the thing that doesn't show up right away. Build it on the ordinary days. Build it without applause, without proof, often without much encouragement from anyone standing nearby, because the people standing nearby are usually just as unable to see your roots growing as you are.
So let me ask you, plainly, the question this has all been circling around since the first sentence. What season are you actually in right now, today? Not the season you wish you were in, not the season you're pretending to be in for the people watching, but the one you're honestly standing inside of when nobody else is looking. Maybe it's winter. Maybe it's been winter longer than you expected, longer than you think is fair. Long enough that you've started quietly wondering whether spring is something that happens to other people and simply skips certain lives, yours among them. I want to be careful here, because I'm not going to tell you winter is secretly wonderful, or that you should be grateful for it, or any of the things people say when they've never actually stood in the cold themselves. Winter is hard. It's allowed to be hard. You're allowed to find it hard without that meaning anything has gone wrong with you, or with your character, or with whatever you believe about how life is supposed to work. But I am going to ask you not to confuse the length of a season with the absence of a spring. Some winters are short. Some are long enough to make you forget what the other seasons even felt like. I can't promise you which kind of winter you're in, and anyone who claims they can promise you that from the outside is selling you something. What I can tell you, with more confidence than almost anything else in this whole conversation, is that winter has never once, in the entire history of every life I've watched closely enough to know the full story, been a permanent address. It has always eventually turned. Always. Not always on the timeline anyone would have chosen, but always. What's actually within your control while you're waiting on that turn is not the calendar. You don't get to move the calendar. What's within your control is whether you spend this particular winter the way the man at the diner spent 20 years of winters, or the way the man above the hardware store spent his. Whether you let the cold convince you that nothing is worth starting until conditions improve, or whether you start anyway, quietly, with no proof yet that it's going to work, because that's the only time starting has ever actually counted for anything. Anyone can start once spring has clearly arrived. That's not discipline. That's just noticing the weather. The only version of starting that actually builds anything durable is the version that happens while it's still cold, while there's still no evidence, while the only person who knows you started is you. I want to say something now about blame, because I think it matters, and I don't want to leave it unsaid. Some of what's cold in your life right now may genuinely not be your fault. I believe that. Genuine misfortune exists. Genuine unfairness exists. People get dealt circumstances they did absolutely nothing to deserve. And I have no interest in standing here and pretending otherwise, because that would be a lie, and a fairly cruel one. But here's the distinction that's made the difference. In every life I've watched closely enough to actually learn from it, the frost arriving was not your fault. What you plant during the frost is entirely your decision, every single time, regardless of who or what put you out in the cold to begin with. Blame might be accurate. Blame might even be fully justified. But blame, accurate or not, has never once planted a single seed. It's never trimmed a single sail. It's never pulled a single weed. It explains the weather. It does nothing whatsoever about the rigging. This is the part where personal responsibility actually earns its place in this conversation, instead of being just another phrase people throw around without meaning much by it. It doesn't mean pretending you caused everything that's gone wrong. It means recognizing that, regardless of what caused it, you are still the only one holding the tools that determine what happens next. Nobody else is coming to read your books for you. Nobody else can sit in your rigging and adjust it on your behalf. Nobody else's hands are the ones that get to decide what grows in the space your life occupies. That's not a punishment. It's the only real freedom available to anyone standing in a hard season. The freedom to decide what you do with your own hands, regardless of who's responsible for the weather. I think about all the people I've watched move through hard seasons over the years, and the ones who came out the other side stronger almost never had it easier than the ones who didn't, often the opposite. What they had, without exception, was some version of the same decision, made early and quietly, usually with no one cheering them on and no proof yet that it would amount to anything. They decided that this particular cold spell, however long it lasted, however unfair it might genuinely be, was still going to be a season they did something with, rather than a season they simply endured and waited out. There's a particular kind of person, and you may know one, maybe you've been one, who treats every hard season as proof that effort is pointless until the hard season ends. They're not lazy, usually. They're tired and worn down, and not entirely wrong that the conditions are difficult, but they've drawn a line in their own mind between now, which doesn't count, and later, once things improve, which is when the real building will finally begin. The trouble with that line is that it keeps moving. Later rarely arrives the way it's imagined. And even when conditions do eventually improve, the habits of waiting have usually settled in deep enough by then that improved conditions don't automatically produce improved effort. The waiting becomes its own season, longer than the original winter ever was, and far less honest about what it actually is. The few who avoid that particular trap are not the ones who feel less tired or less discouraged or less entitled to complain about genuinely difficult circumstances. They're simply the ones who decided at some point, usually quietly, usually without anyone else noticing the decision was even made, that now counts. Not later, now, exactly as it is, cold and unfinished and unfair in places, still counts as a season worth planting in. Let me leave you with something practical before I leave you with something final, because I don't want this to end as only a feeling, the kind that's warm for an afternoon and gone by the following Tuesday once ordinary life crowds back in. Pick one, just one. Out of everything we've gone through, the reading, the rigging, the table you sit at, the small plot of ground you've been neglecting without quite admitting it to yourself, pick the one that landed hardest while you were listening, the one that made some part of you go quiet for a second because it was a little too accurate. Don't pick all of them. That's how good intentions die, smothered under their own ambition before the first week is even over. Pick one, and then do the smallest possible version of it today. Not next month, not once things calm down, not once you feel more ready, because feeling ready is not a precondition any of this has ever actually required. If it's reading, that doesn't mean a reading list and a new shelf and a complete personal transformation by Friday. It means opening one book tonight for 15 minutes. If it's the table you sit at, that doesn't mean a dramatic goodbye to anyone. It might just mean accepting the one invitation you've been declining to the one room where a different custom might be quietly in effect. If it's the garden, it might just mean fixing the one thing you've been rooting around for months because fixing it felt like too much, when in fact, it would have taken 20 minutes if you'd simply started. The size of the first action has never mattered nearly as much as people assume. What matters is that it's a real action taken today in the actual cold you're actually standing in, rather than a plan for an imagined spring that hasn't arrived yet and may not arrive on the schedule you're quietly hoping for. 50 bulbs is not an impressive number. It's barely an afternoon's work. But 50 bulbs planted on one gray Saturday in October is the entire distance between a yard that blooms in March and a yard that doesn't. I want you to picture two versions of yourself, 5 years from where you're sitting right now, because I think the contrast is more honest than anything else I could tell you directly. One version kept doing roughly what's been done so far. The same rooms, the same evenings spent the same way, the same plot of ground left to whatever happens to grow there on its own. That version isn't a failure. I want to be clear about that. That version is simply further along the same road already being walked, which, depending on the road, may be perfectly fine, or maybe a slow drift toward a place that was never actually chosen on purpose. The other version made the one small adjustment we just talked about and then kept making it in small, unglamorous ways through several winters that didn't feel any easier than the one happening right now. Because winters rarely do feel easier in the moment, regardless of how well a person is using them. That version, 5 years out, is not necessarily rich or famous or free of every problem they started with. That was never the promise. And I'd rather tell you that plainly now than have you discover it was never the promise later, disappointed, with the unfair sense that something was misrepresented to you. But that version has built something the other one hasn't. A deeper root system, better rigging, a fuller shelf of quiet hours nobody else witnessed, a table surrounded by people who expect more out of a Tuesday than complaining about it, a plot of ground that's been tended on purpose instead of left to whatever wind blew through it. 5 years is going to pass regardless of which version you become. That part isn't optional, and no amount of waiting changes it. The only thing actually still undecided, sitting open in front of you exactly as you are right now, is which of those two versions gets to be the one standing there when the 5 years are finally up. Let me tell you something about spring, though, before we get all the way to the end of this, because I think it gets misunderstood almost as badly as winter does, just in the opposite direction. Spring is not the finish line. I think a lot of us somewhere along the way picked up the idea that spring is where the story ends. That once the hard season finally breaks, once the harvest finally comes in, once the thing you've been quietly working toward in the dark finally shows up where everyone can see it, that's the resolution. The part where the music settles and the credits roll and you finally get the stop. It isn't. And believing it is has quietly ruined the actual spring for a lot of people who worked hard enough to deserve to enjoy it. Spring is a season, exactly like the other three. It doesn't last forever, and it was never built to. The orchard that blooms in April is the same orchard that will need tending all summer and harvesting in fall, and will eventually, on schedule, the way it always has, go back into another winter the following year. The bulbs that bloomed in March, the ones we buried in the cold back in October, don't bloom permanently. They bloom for a few weeks, and then that particular bloom is over. And if you want another one next year, you're back out in the cold dirt again come October, doing the same unglamorous work, with no guarantee handed to you in advance that it'll work as well the second time as it did the first. I tell you this not to take anything away from the relief of an actual spring arriving after a real winter, because that relief is earned, and I'd never want to talk you out of feeling it fully when it finally comes. I tell you this because I've watched people work hard enough to reach their spring, and then, once they got there, quietly stop everything that got them there, as if the disciplines were a means to an end, instead of simply how a person who wants more than one good season learns to live. They stop reading once things are going well, because reading felt like a survival tool, and survival doesn't feel urgent anymore. They drift out of the room above the hardware store once their own business finally starts working, because the room was for people still trying to make it, and they've made it now, or so it seems. They let the rigging go slack once a few calm years roll by in a row, because the storm feels like something that happened to an earlier, less fortunate version of themselves. And then, eventually, because this is simply how seasons work and always have, winter comes around again. It always does. There is no version of a life, no matter how well built, that gets permanently exempted from the cycle continuing. And the people who stop tending once spring arrived the first time are often caught more off guard the second time than they were the first, because somewhere in the good years, they convinced themselves the cycle had finally ended in their particular case, that they'd graduated out of seasons altogether and into some permanent, unchanging summer that the rest of us still have to deal with, but they no longer do. The few who hold on to what they built, not just for one spring, but across several full cycles, decade after decade, are the ones who never fully believed that story. They enjoyed the spring, honestly, without apology, without pretending the relief wasn't real. And they kept reading anyway. They kept showing up to the room above the hardware store, even once they didn't strictly need to anymore. Sometimes specifically so they could be the person handing somebody else a book at the end of a table, the way it was once handed to them. They kept checking the rigging on calm days, even when there wasn't a cloud anywhere on the horizon, because they understood, the way Holt understood it, without ever needing to dress it up in fancier language, that the calm days are not a reward for finishing the work. The calm days are simply where the next round of the work gets done, quietly, before anyone needs it yet. I don't say any of this to make spring sound like a trick, or to suggest that working hard toward it is somehow pointless because winter always comes back around afterward. I say it because I think the truest, sturdiest kind of contentment available to anyone doesn't come from finally arriving at a permanent spring that never has to be defended again. It comes from making peace with the actual shape of things. Seasons, all four of them, repeating, none of them permanent, each one asking something different of you, and choosing, season after season, to do the kind of work that particular season was built for, instead of resenting the season for not being a different one. I'll say one more small thing before we get to the actual end of this. Staying with something like this for as long as you have, on an ordinary day, when there were 50 easier and more immediately enjoyable ways you could have spent the same stretch of time, is itself a small kind of planting, not a large one. I won't pretend listening to anything on its own rebuilds an orchard, but it's the same shape as everything else we've talked about. A quiet, unremarkable choice, made in private, with no one keeping score, in the general direction of the field instead of away from it. Whatever you do with the rest of today, you've already done one small thing differently than you might have. That's worth noticing, plainly, without making more of it than it is. I think back to that line I started with, about the frost not checking the calendar before it comes, and I want to end somewhere close to where we began, because I think it lands differently now than it would have 2 hours ago. The frost still doesn't check the calendar. That part never changes. And no amount of wisdom, no number of disciplines, no quantity of books read in quiet hours is ever going to change it. You will have more winters. I will too. Some of them will arrive on schedule, the ordinary kind everyone half expects. Some of them will arrive in April, after the blossoms are already out, in exactly the way that does the most damage. At exactly the moment you'd convinced yourself you were past that sort of thing. That's not a flaw in the design of things that a better attitude is going to fix. That's simply what it means to be alive long enough to have a real life, with real seasons in it, instead of an imagined one, where the weather, always cooperates. But here's what's also true. Sitting right alongside that, just as solid, just as repeatable, every single orchard that survives a brutal April is standing on root systems that were built during winters nobody was watching. Every boat that comes home clean through a sudden squall is being sailed by hands that learned to trim a sail on 100 unremarkable afternoons when there was no storm in sight to justify the practice. Every yard that blooms in March is blooming because somebody knelt in the cold dirt back in October with no evidence yet that it would work and did the unglamorous thing anyway. None of that is luck. None of it is some special blessing handed to a fortunate few while the rest of us wait our turn for a kinder set of circumstances. It's simply what happens, reliably, almost mechanically, to anyone willing to do the planting, regardless of whether the season currently feels like it deserves the effort.
So if you're standing in a cold season right now, and statistically, given how many people end up listening to something like this, at least some of you are, maybe more than some. I don't have a way to tell you exactly how long it's going to last. I wouldn't trust anyone who claimed they could tell you that with any precision, including me. I won't pretend to know your particular winter from the outside. And I'd be doing you no favors if I tried to flatten it into something smaller than it actually is. What I can tell you, with the kind of confidence that comes from watching this play out in enough lives to stop being surprised by it, is that the length of your winter has very little to do with whether you'll eventually see a spring, and a great deal to do with what you choose to plant while you're standing in it. The frost doesn't ask permission, and it doesn't owe you an apology for arriving when it did, but it also doesn't get the final say. The final say belongs to whatever you decide to do with your hands while it's still cold, which is the one part of this whole arrangement that was always, in every season, in every version of this story I've ever watched closely enough to learn anything from it, entirely yours. Spring always follows winter. It has never once failed to, not in any orchard, not in any harbor, not in any life I've watched closely enough to see the whole arc of it. Spring always follows winter, even when it arrives later than you'd hoped, even when it asks more of you on the way there than you thought was fair. And spring always follows winter most reliably, most generously for the ones who kept planting in the cold instead of waiting for the cold to end before they were willing to start. Your season is coming, not because you're owed it, not because wanting it badly enough is ever by itself enough to summon it early. It's coming because that's how the cycle has always worked. For everyone willing to do the only part of it that was ever actually theirs to do. Plant now. Plant in the cold, with no proof yet, with no one watching, with nothing visible to show for it for longer than you'd like. The ground doesn't need you to believe in March while you're standing in December. It only needs you to keep your hands moving. The frost doesn't check the calendar. It never has, and it never will. But neither does spring.